Last week, we had a great conversation with Nick Walker about the concept of embodiment. It was such a great thing to listen to. She's such a smart scholar and always has interesting insights, different ways of looking at things, and I really enjoyed that. And one of the major themes that Nick went through was being aware of how we move through the environment, how important it is to do that in a conscious way and not just move through life habitually, like really be present in our embodiment. And when I was reflecting about that the last couple days and thinking about, one of the earmarks of autism is, the meaningless or destructive or the rituals that we have that are empty. But we don't often stop to think how much the culture at large does this. Like it's sort of a human trait to get your rituals and then embody them and not think about them. For example, we're all worried about the environment, and this 3 weeks we're focusing on is about our physical, like natural environment. Often mentions factory farming, and we all know what essentially that it's terrible for the animals, it's terrible for the environment. It's one of the worst things you can do for water pollution, superbugs, and yet, as a culture, we persist. And so I've been interested in, as we approach ideas of autistic culture and autistic sensitivity, I'm really interested in whether or not we feel like we have a particular responsibility to confront those kinds of larger habits that are destructive or non-functional or sort of just empty comfort rituals and move into some other way of doing things. And what is our responsibility as an autistic culture to try to move the larger culture in a more sustainable direction, for example. So this week, our focus in the outline was Greta Thunberg, who considers her sensitivity about the environment to be part of her superpowers and her responsibility to the environment being rooted, in her autism. I think that's a really interesting point of view. So today I'd like to talk about, and then we'll get into our creativity session, but today I'd like to start out talking a little bit, getting your guys' input about, what do you feel is your personal responsibility to look at your unconscious habits? And as those of you here that are autistic, do you have a unique responsibility to engage in those questions?
Well, I'm a very analytical person in general, so for me, it's not that hard. I always try to reevaluate everything a new piece of information comes about, whether it's politics or personal life or anything else. So just for me, it's kind of become kind of a habit. As soon as I get a gut feeling, I start thinking, is the feeling right? And what am I basing it on? So
Do you use your gut feelings as an additional source of information?
yeah, but for me, it's more of a trigger to think about whether something needs to be considered or not. It's not something I rely on to make the decision. It just, they come up whether you want them or not. So usually, your subconscious brain processes a lot more information than you can do consciously. So generally, there's something that triggers it, whether when you feel something, but it's not
So
always the most analytical part of you.
So it's more of a starting point for you than
Yeah,
a.
it's just something, like an attention, like a red flag. Something needs attention. And then from there, I take it on a more rational basis.
I would definitely, I guess I find everything like it's all very overwhelming to think about, of course. I'm sure it is for everyone. And so like, I really want to do something about it. And like when I moved to Connecticut, there's so much better resources for like recycling and everything than down in Georgia. And so I've started recycling and everything. But then at the same time, I feel like I'm, you know, oh, that like I'm just one person kind of thing. And that what, you know, what more feeling stuck, I guess, and not as hopeful. But I found that like he is way more hopeful than me and like believes that, you know, humanity can change and that we can, you know, do something. And I guess I'm more, it's hard for me to like really believe that, but I really admire that in him, and that he really he believes that everybody can, you know, they just put their minds to it, you know, it'll get better. So,
At some point, you do things not for the results, but because it's the right thing to do. Whether you're the one person that you're like surrounded by a culture that doesn't agree with you or whatever, like how important it is just to live your best nature in a situation like that. And I'd like to talk about that some more too. But Jean, go ahead.
Well, there's no reason, to uproot your life over anything that might happen, because what's the point of, if you can't do anything about it now, there's really no reason to worry about it. But I think we need to think about the climate more objectively, because recycling, as well, it's good, it's not going to save us from global warming. There are things that we could do on a much larger scale. So just people need to stop acting reactively towards, and emotionally towards things, and actually look at data and statistics and figure out what we can actually do.
Well, let's think about like, the ways that we support factory farming. And I think that is a really like good cultural example, because I mean, food is such a central cultural sort of thing, the way that we agree about it, the way that we use it to define culture, how hard it is to change eating habits, for example. And yet on many different levels, we might, for our health, for example, or again for the environment, or just because we like animals or whatever, like we would like to make that change, and yet a lot of us don't. And I wonder why. Like, what keeps us, like, if we rationally know this happens,
I
then
think
this
it's just
happens,
part of human nature, because humans evolved, basically in the savannah over a very long periods of time. We were not designed by evolution to change, for the environment to change so rapidly. So people tend to do everything the way it's always been done. And unfortunately, the world is changing so quickly, we need to learn how to keep up. We can't just, oh, this worked for my parents, it'll work for me, That's no longer the case. Even for me, I'm 42, and I see, younger generations, and their world is completely different from mine. So just even in the last couple of decades, how it's changed. So imagine how quickly it's going to change moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, because, well, I remember watching this another documentary about they're talking about like the domestication of corn. And, yeah, because humans have been doing it for like 9,000 years. Apparently,
Yeah, but now you could modify it genetically, and next year have twice the yield or something.
But think about like how long people have been around, and then how much change has happened in, say, the past 2 decades.
Like
Right.
before, a couple of thousand years ago, nothing really changed in hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
I mean, local things change, but nothing in the scope of environment or industry, or just pretty much everything else.
But
so you guys would say it was probably that people are just too overwhelmed.
It's too much information to process all at once for everybody. So you just need to work together and figure out what's the most practical way of solving these problems that either are current or are looming on the horizon.
Right.
Right.
So
But how much of this is sort of in human nature? So like what we're trying to do now, this idea that everybody gets along, right? How much of it is in our nature or evolution to like
I
keep
don't
up with
think
the
much
demand
of it.
of today's society?
Well, the thing is, if you look, it depends, because we're genetically very close to chimpanzees and bonobos. If you look at chimpanzees, how they behave, they're very violent toward each other, but bonobos are not. So, and we're pretty much as close as to one as to the other. So I'm hoping we're somewhere in between the two, and we could sort of, and we have our rationality, and we could think about these things and just do what's for the greater good. But we do have instinct that's probably not the best to do these things. But I think we could
Well,
overcome them.
interestingly, as a primatologist, I mean, you're essentially correct about those things. We are genetically closer to bonobos, who are more peaceful. I like to think that that's sort of,
That's where I'm hoping for.
genetic
That we're
relation.
socially closer to them.
Yes, and I mean, I think that it's such a persistent trope, that desire to get along. I mean, I do think that that's deeply planted. Do you think so, Roger? Or do you think it's just a cultural fallacy that we can do it?
Well, I think that we are designed to get along locally.
Yeah.
I do wonder this sort of globalization, if we're designed for all that, because, I think we've probably evolved, our survival dependent on maybe local tribes, things like that. But the idea that the whole world is going to get along, that I'm not so sure about, because in our evolution, we, I guess, banded locally, but we're, I guess, for the longest time been fighting other tribes. So,
I mean, we lived in groups for like 30, 40 individuals. So we got along pretty well, I guess, in the local group, because, you wouldn't survive otherwise. But there were always conflicts between them. So I think we just need to expand what we consider a tribe.
my impression is we don't tolerate differences very well.
Well, we're not genetically predisposed to use TikTok, and most people seem to have no problem with that. So I think there are things we could definitely do to overcome our
Yeah.
genetic limitations.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, because there's 8 billion people in this world, right? So like trying to get 8 billion people to think this way, I mean, I would
No,
love.
it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Of course, everybody's not going to be all huggy and friendly with each other. But I think we could learn to be at least tolerant. We're
Yeah,
not
we have
going to
to
learn
try.
to love everybody, but I think we
have to
could learn
try.
to tolerate each other.
Yeah, I mean, you can cooperate with people you detest if there's mutual benefit to be gained. And
We
in
have
terms
common
of the
goals. Everybody wants
environment,
to live.
it's to bring it back to the natural environment. I mean, that's going to be sort of a do or die skill to have, right? To cooperate with people that you don't necessarily agree with or even like, but there's mutual benefit to be had.
That sounds like definitely a very cerebral type of activity.
Well, that's what we're good at. That's what makes us different from all other animals.
They almost seem like reflexes, right? It's like people kind of react and then they don't really think about why they're reacting a certain way or why they're doing what they're doing.
Well, that's the point I was making. That's when I have that reaction, because I think that's just part of being human. I don't think we could ever get rid of that. But once you have that reaction, you should consider all what led you to have that reaction, whether it's based on something.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
We should
And
teach these
Julie, on that note, I want to be sure that we really quick get to the sort of weekly assignment. And I know usually, I say do anything, like express yourself in any medium. But today, if people could stick to writing, I think it would be sort of advantageous. If we took like 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes, and wrote down, what is our responsibility? How are we affected culturally? What things would we like to look at in terms of our own behavior, and what are the skills that are unique to us that will help us to make the changes that we think need to be made. So yes, if you guys want to continue to talk, that's great. I'm going to start writing down a few of my thoughts, and then when we get done with the writing project, we can share that at the end. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So carry on if you want to talk. I'm going to
I'm
grab.
better
my-
at talking. Well, I'm good at writing, but usually I'm good at rattling things off too. So
Okay, well, you do you and figure out however you're comfortable.
Yeah, we talk about autistics not being able to take perspectives, right? But really, it's sort of like I mean, in my opinion, I think it's a very human problem, is that, we tend to kind of suck at taking perspectives that are outside our own, or people or our sort of social circle, so to speak. So it's almost like, in order for people to have more sort of acceptance, and sort of understanding, uh, you have to teach sort of the people who the majority, to experience like a minority, and I wonder, like, how do you make something like that happen, right? Beyond just, I mean, I think it's great that this the cultural project, I think, is a huge step, in the right direction. Um, but I guess, like, what I'm struggling with is like, how do you bring this sort of into sort of the mainstream, where it's more intuitive, to most people. I mean, you're not going to reach everybody, but if you can somehow, reach most people so they can easily just get it, then maybe something like that can evolve more quickly.
Well, I think for me personally, when I've made the biggest changes in my life, I've had to be exposed to an idea multiple times. I've had to hear it get, the framework shared with me from a lot of different perspectives before it really starts to take shape in a way that affects my behavior. And I think that the unique ways that people on the spectrum can communicate and experience these things and getting those voices out there will sort of help that critical mass. I ask myself that question every day, Roger. How do you translate? How do you help people understand a perspective? I mean, it's woven into my being, into my work. How do you get people to make those connections? Obviously, I haven't come up with the magic.
I think I'm
method.
sorry. I think we just need to get more acceptance in the workplace, for example. I think autistic people are vastly underutilized in the industry because we have certain types of skills. For example, if you have a special interest with something, we're going to spend day and night doing it and researching it, and we could do it probably a lot better than a lot of neurotypicals can. I know a lot of people, for example, well, just for my just like another group, my local group, there's a couple of them are data analysts, and I think that would probably a great job for some of us because we could sit there and if it's something interesting to us, we could spend hours on it. Another person, she has the Guinness World Record for hula hooping she's also a data analyst, but I'm just giving you as an example. She has the World Guinness Record for hula hooping for 100 hours straight.
Wow.
So if we're really interested into something, we're going to spend a lot of effort and time into it. I've actually read an article that the Israeli border service has autistic people monitoring the border cameras. And they're saying they could do it better than the neurotypical person ever could because they're so focused on it that they would, they pick up things that normal people would not and just get tired of doing it. So I think that we have certain strengths that we just need to show people that we could use them and they're useful to them.
Be
Yeah,
autistic for a living. That's what I always say.
Yeah, no, and maybe that is sort of part of that, sort of bringing this into a mainstream, is the awareness that, I mean, obviously autistic people have been around, since people have been around. And I would say a lot of what we enjoy today, whether we're aware of it or not, was probably developed by a neurodivergent mind, or a lot of neurodivergent minds have had something to do with that. You know,
I mean, we survived this long, so there's obviously an evolutionary advantage to being this. Otherwise, we just would have, just
Right.
wiped out a long time ago. I have a list of autistic people throughout history, possible autistic. It's hard to diagnose somebody posthumously, obviously, but people like Alexander the Great might have been autistic because obviously he was focused on one thing and got it done pretty well. People like well, just with computers, probably half of technological advancements are due to somebody neurodivergent.
yeah, and I wonder if, how much people know that, right? Yeah, I mean, know it, and not just some sort of trivial fact of trivia, right? But know it and then understand why it's
Well,
like,
Temple Grandin made a good example that the person who probably invented the spear was a good chance that he was autistic. While everybody was just sitting talking around the campfire, he was there perfecting the perfect arrowhead or a spearhead or something like that. And I could totally see that somebody autistic would dedicate their life to something like that.
I can see that too. That and the wheel.
Yeah.
Most of the population can wrap their minds around this, right? The fact that we enjoy a lot of things we have no understanding of whatsoever. And the fact that we have no understanding of it, is I guess a vehicle into thinking that, the minds that develop those things, we might not understand those minds, but yet they are really what make our society tick or our civilization run the way it does.
I think we need more people who are autistic to come out as autistic, especially people that are influential, for example, business leaders, things like, people like Bill Gates, maybe Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk was just saying that, showing that people like us are capable of doing things.
Right. Well, he's not the
just
only
having representation in the world.
Absolutely. And yeah, no, I think that really is the way, is to sort of, we know things that impact our everyday lives. We have these things because of, I think in large part due to our neurodiversity. Like your average person on the street, do they know how like a cell phone works? Or even how the software works, or like how a car works, but yet, we don't
They
know
can
anything
even
about.
make a stone tool, Roger.
What's that?
They can't even make a stone tool.
Absolutely.
Well, to be fair, I probably couldn't
This is
either.
what I mean. So it's sort of like, we take so much for granted, but a human mind had to or a bunch of human minds had to sort of work together to develop that. And that mind is probably not the same as like the ones that you have in your classroom or like, the ones that are in your family, things like that. It's just that, we don't hear those stories, and that this is probably what's helpful with your comment, Don, is that, people coming out and sharing their stories, and, people being well aware of the voices, so they can, recalibrate, what it is, to have a mind that thinks, works, perceives differently, and being able to make those connections between, everything that we have now, you could probably trace back to a lot of folks who are a lot different from your average Joe on the street.
Yes, and they're often persecuted at the time, which is like a whole other layer to like that makes it even harder to foment change, either personally or on a cultural level, is that you're afraid of your detractors because it has gone very badly at times.
Well, that's why I think it's almost like human nature. You guys probably heard of that book, the Selfish Gene. I guess the idea is that our survival is about self-preservation. So self-preservation in a population has scarce resources, meaning that it works kind of like a zero sums game, I guess, way back, in that protecting yourself, or maybe casting someone out, meant there might be more for you. So, and maybe in a smaller setting, that there may be a sliver of truth of that, but certainly not like in this day and age. But
Right.
this day and age is sort of recent history compared to sort of the long history of human beings and our evolution. So it's almost like like you have to condition people, differently. Maybe like
Yeah,
starting
the
when
thing
you're really
is,
young.
we don't live in an age of scarcity anymore. We don't have to fight over an antelope, which village gets to keep that antelope, and one lives and the other one dies.
Absolutely.
Now we're so interlinked that it's more about common interest than
Right.
personal interest.
Exactly. But that's a recent evolution in our
Yeah.
history. So then, but our minds, or our nature, it is not based on that at all. But that's exactly what's needed, I think, for people to. That's kind of like the next generation of humans. If we're going to survive, then we have to learn to get along like that. And
Yeah. I mean, I will say though that having been a student of social animals all my life, I mean, if you think back to the Skinner experiments, where the baby monkey would choose the monkey-like stuffed animal rather than food because it was seeking comfort and connection. I think that runs much deeper than that kind of momentary panic when resources run out. I think that might be a temporary solution, but then this survival of this most socially fit, I think, tends to win out for social animals again and again.
But that's also developmental, isn't it? So if you're a baby primate, you have to. I mean, your survival depends on hanging on to, I guess, the parent. But that
Yes,
does
but it
change over time.
continues that kind of connection, like physical proximity and physical touch, continues to be just as important after infancy, and that's something that we lose. I mean, in fact, culturally, we start it early because we put babies in rooms by themselves in cribs and walk out, which is something, you know, a normal self-respecting primate would never do. And so I would say, from my point of view, that kind of physical proximity and that tactile language remains just as important in a slightly shifting way, but still really critical. That would be my point of
Well, I
view.
think we still need connection. We're, after all, talking to each other through computers right now. So it's not like, even though we're not in the physical room, we have a lot more opportunities to connect with people, because otherwise, even my local New York autistic group, I would not be able to find any of them without the internet. If I was just looking in my local neighborhood, that would just, maybe I'll run across one or two, randomly by chance, but realistically, we could seek connections in a much wider field. We just need to open up our scope of how we connect to other people.
Yes, I mean, indigenous people do that routinely. I mean, they're taught to have those broader connections as though they are part of their own bodies from the time they're born, right? So there's hope, I guess, is what I'm
But there are
saying.
also, but those are local. You're not gonna, that applies maybe to their tribe or regional area, but it's not, a different continent, thousands of miles away. So we just need to take those drives and instincts and just expand who they apply to.
Yes, and I agree with Roger that there's the eternal question of how do we do that efficiently and kindly, and yeah, what does that process look like? And I think as autistic people and allies, we're in a unique position to offer insights on how to do that. because we're kind of systems people, you know. We can back up and look at patterns and what works and what doesn't work.
Can I ask you what your impressions are for autistics in how they view the value of virtual meetings, electronic communication? Like, and the folks that, I mean, your own opinion, but also like most of the people that you kind of interact with, do you think that, I guess you probably, everyone's going to be different, but I'm just wondering, if there is a predominance of people who are really interested in this sort of thing, or people who sort of deem it to be unworthy because it lacks that face-to-face.
Well, I mean, this might be a little biased because, I see the people who are actually participating. I don't know how many just aren't. So it's kind of hard to make that distinction. But from what I could tell, most of the people in the groups I'm in appreciate this because, we can communicate each other on a different, through distance of time, because, there are chat rooms and things like that, that you don't have to be at the same time with the person. So in a way, it makes it easier, but we still have in-person meetings because a lot of people do seek that personal connection with people. So I think it has to be a balance of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people I know, we've sort of talked about it, and the general feeling is very positive because human interaction is so intense when we're in proximity. And again, that deep social drive, it can be very overwhelming. And so I feel like this sort of gives a little distance from the energy of the exchange in a way that makes energetically sensitive people capable of engaging in a different way on different levels.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that it totally sort of, that makes so much sense to me, that it's a good, you can also see it as like a stepping stone. If the in-person thing is, I mean, there's so many things about in-person, like, you don't want to be stuck in an experience that is making you upset or nervous. Logistical things. But I know some folks who are, I guess, most of their upbringing, it's always been about sort of in-person, face-to-face. That's what social interactions are supposed to be. And if it's not like that, then it's not really a real interaction. It's not worthy. And I know a few folks that are like that.
I have a comment about that. I think that the harder it is for you to find your tribe, the more valuable the digital and video chat and all is, because, I mean, going back to even back to before I had kids, me and some friends who didn't see each other very often, were visualizing having something sort of like a Yahoo group, basically, to discuss, the subject we talked about when we were together. But we lived in different states. The harder it is to find the people, your tribe, the people you connect with, the more valuable this is. So I think that is one of the attractions, probably, for a lot of people who are autistic. I would guess, not being autistic myself, I can only guess, but is that you can find your tribe that way.
Yeah, and I think getting away from the notion that tribe has to mean something that's sort of proximal. It's something where, like, people are very much local and spending face-to-face time, a lot of face-to-face time. The notion that, like, that really it is sort of the connection is not so much physical than it is sort of maybe emotional, psychological, which can be there's different ways that can be done, and whether or not people really believe that, and maybe they don't believe that, maybe it's because they haven't experienced it.
We need to focus on common experiences because in my New York group, it's New York, so there's a lot of diversity in the group and we're all very different. But there's something we share being autistic that we have common experiences with that. So that kind of makes us bind together. Even we might disagree on something or have different interests, things like that. There's something that we have in common that binds us. So I think
You know, I
that's what
wanted
we
to
need to.
comment on that, on Roger's comment, and then what you were saying, Jean. Another level of this that we rarely explore is kind of the spiritual side of things, because I've mentioned here before, I think there's a strong shamanic component to to being autistic, to being really super sensitive, to feeling like everything around you is part of you, having unique insights about, how to solve problems, for example. And that itself takes the ability to get out of your body. So I feel in this case, like the internet is really sort of, in a way, just mirroring the spirit world, if you know what I mean. I think that that it's real. Like, if you have those capabilities, you do feel the people that you're engaging with, even if they're across the world, because space-time really doesn't have a lot of meaning. Maybe that's way out there, but that's another level that I'm interested in.
I think there needs to be a balance because I could give you an example. There's about 150 people on our local New York Discord channel server, but usually at meetings, there's about, I don't know, 25, 30 people show up. On the Discord, sometimes there's a lot of arguments over misunderstandings. And it almost obviously it's not physical fights, but it gets pretty intense. Never happened in our personal meetings. So I think a personal connection, you get, people are more civil to each other because they understand, there's intonation, there are things like that that could be misinterpreted online, even through video. So I think personal connections are still very important, but just being able to find those people to have connections with became much easier with the internet.
So surprised with virtual because it's possible to meet everyone, everybody, everywhere. You just have the internet and a computer or a cell phone, and then everything is possible.
Watching movies I never been to South America or China, but just through watching shows and movies, I have a good understanding of, how those people are, what their lives are like. It's much better than it used to be, let's say 100 years ago, where basically all you knew, maybe you read a few books, but you didn't see personal experiences of people living somewhere thousands of miles away from you.
And that's where the group, like a vast array of voices, comes in as being so important, because that, as you're underscoring, that kind of connection, that access to different points of view is so important.
Movies. Basically, I was thinking about fiction. Fiction is a very powerful way to change, starting from book, little children's books, to change your ideas about race, about um, sexuality, gender, um, and you notice it, but if it happens too fast, you end up with a backlash. They never lack having at least one or two characters who are gay. They often have somebody that's transgender. And of course they have people, they have people from Asia, people from Africa, like this is big mix. And I think that's affecting the younger population, the older population, because it happens so fast. The older population, a lot of them are still, unfortunately, it brings up their ire instead of opening them up. But I think that starting really young, the more exposure you have to differences through literature, through movies, through TV, uh, the more open-minded you're going to be, I guess, about whatever the subject, climate change or any social issues.
Yeah, that saying that change occurs one death at a time seems sort of pessimistic. I hope that isn't really true, but you know, it does resonate at times.
I think that's a great point about how that has to start early. You know, these narratives that we have in our heads, you know, probably have roots from early on in our lives. It's almost like once things don't fit the narrative, then we tend to reject them. It's probably like no one really gets along that well.
Well, I think your personality forms, your core personality forms pretty early. So if you're exposed to diversity of opinions and just, you know, seeing the world early on, I think that makes it easier once you get older. If you lived in a, you know, in a certain type of environment all your life, and that's all you know, when you're maybe 30, you get exposed to the world. It seems so strange to you and so different from yours. It's sort of hard to accept. So maybe the next generation will have an easier time with it than we did.
I do wonder, like, you know, if people, if their experiences may lend them to a more sort of open mindset, or you know, a more sort of non-traditional way of connecting with other people, especially through technology. I mean, it's not something I grew up with, so the idea to me is more foreign. But yeah, there are folks, yeah, that this is sort of normal. Yeah, so
Well, who knows? Maybe things like virtual reality will be a good thing. Maybe people will see, though not in person, but you know, see more of the lives of people around them. So maybe things like that could have a positive effect.
So when I was young, and we started becoming aware of the climate issues, uh, pollution, you know, all this stuff, we thought, you know, we were more hopeful. We thought that if people knew, things would change. It didn't really work out that way. But what's happening now is a lot of this stuff is making it into fiction, into books and media, you know, other types of media, but fiction. I think that maybe gives me a little hope that it might have a deeper effect. Just knowing politically, you know, what's happening, I think doesn't have as strong an effect on people as you know, getting attached to characters and what's happening in their lives in these stories. I think that has, and that's more recent. I mean, that wasn't really happening, you know, for many years. You know, we started thinking about recycling, but of course most people weren't doing recycling. But you know, we started thinking about recycling. We weren't even thinking about gay marriage back then. We were only thinking about, you know, not getting arrested if you went to a gay club, you know? I mean, so, you know, everything's just sort of, but it wasn't happening in stories. It wasn't, and stories I think are very powerful. So maybe that gives me a little more hope because I've been very discouraged that it's like, I always feel like we go, you know, one step forward, two steps back, you know, for the last 50 years, not not actually gaining any ground, you know?
It's really cool that, I mean, it's almost starts a feedback loop, right? Because ideas start to gain a foothold in culture and then start showing up in things like just cultural products, like fiction, like what we read, which in turn validates the idea further and it gains ground. And that's yet another arm of like another set of voices for people who, as you say, you know, that form works well to get them to change because they identify with the characters and it's a whole different psychological experience. And so, you know, again, the protesters, the fiction, just things like we're doing today, all that myriad of voices, I think, you know, causes that feedback loop. So I like that point about not, fiction. I think that's really true.
Oh, I could sort of relate from a little later generation because when I thought, when the internet was coming around, I thought that was going to be the greatest thing ever. Everyone's going to have access to all the information of the world, just use that, learn everything they can. And then, TikTok and Instagram came out and everybody was so focused on that and social media that they forgot about everything else mostly. But I think it filters through eventually, even though there's going to be upsides and downsides. I think just the fact that it's there and the opportunity is there is going to filter down through society a little better, especially like you said, through stories. I think that's a powerful way to communicate experiences to people. It's hard to, you could write about slavery all you want, but if you see a movie about slavery, how it actually, portrayed, it's going to change you on a personal level a lot more than reading it in the historical context, for example.
So now we can watch shows from South Korea, shows from Thailand and China and all different countries in Europe, and there's not too much. Occasional something from Africa, but not too much. But Australia, just different places that even like a few years ago, Netflix there was this much stuff on. It wasn't so prominent on Netflix. It's becoming more uh, prominent in our culture for there to be lots of cultural perspectives particularly in fiction, that there wasn't before.
Yeah, and there's no central, it seems like now with sort of mass communication, there's no way to really control that information anymore. It's just sort of been set free. The church can't control it, the state can't control it. It's there for everyone. And so this is going to be the great experiment, I think. The wild and free exchange of ideas is going to tell us a lot about what real human nature is, as opposed to being enforced from an outside body. It's very democratic, so I guess we'll have to see what happens, right? Well, if it's okay with you guys, since we're winding down, I'll just read real quick a couple of thoughts that I wrote down on the subject to bring us full circle, and then I'll go over some notes about next week. So I wrote, I feel everything as my own body. So I feel every moment I'm conscious, I'm feeling what everything is feeling. So I guess selfishly, I feel driven to alleviate suffering in any way I can. Like Temple Grandin, animals gave me personhood, taught me to function as a social being. Unlike Temple Grandin, I feel animal suffering as my own. The gorillas who gave me my personhood helped me understand that I wasn't just part of them, but everything is connected to everything else, including me. For me, learning to march to my own drum and getting used to constant discomfort has made it relatively easy to change my habits. And then I wrote down kind of as a separate thought, maybe suffering is necessary for empathy. So as usual, I'd love for you guys to express yourselves in some way and get it up on Facebook so we can have a discussion about it. These conversations are always so thrilling to me. I hear things I've never heard before, and so interesting to get people's perspectives. For next week, we're going to do a little bit of a field trip. If you guys can manage it this week, we're at the week where we go out and observe an animal. So you can pick a squirrel in the park, or a spider in the corner of your house, or your dog, or whatever you choose. And I'll put these sort of prompting questions up for you guys to think about while you do that. So for example, how are your social, sensory, and conscious experiences the same as the animal that you choose to observe? How does autism, or not being autistic, impact how you observe and what you observe? And then Roger's now famous question, if you could be any animal, what would it be? So we'll be discussing all those things next week. And like I said, I'll put those up on the Facebook page as prompts. And I'll just let you guys know that I think about you when we're not online. I wonder what you're doing and if you're doing well. And you know, I care about your lives. So to me, this is very real. And I look forward to seeing you in your little boxes every week. The Hollywood Squares.
Likewise.